I want to segue now to a big part of what you also do then, and that is talk about personality types. So you're an MBTI practitioner, you use Clifton Strengths Finder. What do you think the role is of personality in all of this?
Yeah. You're pushing all of my buttons of what I love to talk about here. So, Meg, I'm getting excited. What I love about talking about personality relates back to the two fish in the water. When we're thinking about those fish that are swimming along and they're saying, what is the water? What are we talking about here? Personality is the same way. We are all different. We are all wired differently. But until we can find language around that, we're just kind of blindly operating based however we've operated before. And so when you know the way that you're wired, it gives you an advantage because, again, now you can operate from that space intentionally. So within yourself, intrapersonally, it allows you to have clarity in the unique way that your mind is wired so that you're clear on how you make decisions, so that you're clear on how you learn, so that you're clear on the things that are important to you and the way that you go about seeing your world. But then interpersonally in the outer world, you're also able to pick up on those things from others as well. Because not everyone's just like you, but we unconsciously believe that people should act like us. And so if this is how I'm going to behave in a situation and someone else behaves differently, what's wrong? Right? It creates that disconnect. So there's just so much power in having that language. So again, we can operate from that space of intentionality.
There's a lot to unpack there. The first one I'm hearing, Gary, is about getting to know yourself, getting in touch with yourself and knowing yourself a little bit more. The second one is to come to the realization that everyone is different. The third one, starts heading towards the platinum rule, which is treating other people the way they want to be treated, not the way you want to be treated. So yeah, there's something quite deep there. In terms of the techniques, so there's lots of different profiling tools on the market. There's so many. I feel like I've done many of them. I haven't done them all, but I've done many of them. They all have slightly different purposes and slightly different slants. So you've got MBTI, you've got Clifton, you've got lifestyle inventory, you've got DISC, you've got Hogan profiles, you've got EQI, you've got Enneagrams, you've got, I think if I kept going, there's probably more that I'm not thinking of, but there's so many of them. How does someone decide which one to use?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, they're all tools. And every tool is going to have a different best case use.
Okay.
If you think of a tool, right? If all we were trying to do is build a house with a single tool and all I gave you was a hammer, it's going to be really hard to build that house. You need some other equipment. And so depending on your goal, depending on what you're trying to achieve, there's tons of different tools out there that can help you with it. Now, for me, the work that I do, I specialize in using both Myers-Briggs and Clifton Strengths because I believe they complement each other really well. There's ways to kind of zoom out and look at it on a macro level and ways to zoom in and get a really nuanced approach with both of those tools. And that's not always talked about out there, right? Sometimes it's just, oh yeah, these are my letters. Oh yeah, these are my top 5. Or, oh yeah, this is my Enneagram type or whatever. But there's so many layers to every tool out there. And so the first thing that I would encourage you to think about when you're trying to figure out, how do I start this journey? What tools should I use? Is to figure out, well, what are you trying to achieve?
Right.
What are you trying to learn about yourself? What are you trying to learn about your team? What is the purpose of this? Is it to check a box and say, yeah, we value the uniqueness of the people on our team? Okay, then pick one out of the hat, right? But if we're really starting to look at how people show up in the way that they communicate, or the tension between a manager and his or her team, or whatever, right? Like, what are we really trying to dig into here? Good. Now we know the goal, the outcome that we're trying to go after, and then we can reverse engineer it. We can find the appropriate tool to make sure that it's going to serve that purpose.
Yeah, really good. You're touching on something I'd like to explore a little bit further. It's about the ways that it can be used that are not helpful. Let's explore that a little bit. So whether it's DISC or MBTI or any of these programs, have you seen examples where it's been used in a way that you go, that's not a very smart way to use these tools?
All the time. All the time. There's so many examples rolling through my mind. I think there's, again, the different layers of it. So on an individual level, if you're trying to explore who you are in your own identity, in your uniqueness, sometimes people will use an assessment to alleviate the cognitive workload that may be required to actually do the deep work. Right. And it's like, oh, well, since I'm in, fill in the personality trait here, since I'm an introvert, I don't have to talk to people. Or since I'm an extrovert, I don't need to sit there and fill in that report. Or since I prefer thinking, I don't need to be considerate of how this is going to impact other people. And the list could go on. Okay, this isn't an excuse. This isn't providing you the back door to get out of whatever problem or situation you're in. This is to give you language in the way that your mind is naturally wired so that we can start with that as a clear foundation and continue to build the emotional intelligence of who you are, your inner world awareness, your outer world awareness of other people's experiences. It's a foundational building block. Okay. So that's one thing, is on the individual level. On the team level, loads of examples there as well. I've heard those same accusations coming from leaders in organizations. Well, you can't do this because you are an introvert.
Okay.
Watch me. Right? It's a preference. It doesn't speak to skill.
Correct.
Okay. I have a preference of introversion. A lot of times people don't expect that. When I teach, when I facilitate, when I'm in front of a group, when I'm leading a team, a lot of people wouldn't expect that I have a preference of introversion. Well, all that's speaking to is my energy. My energy is naturally focused a bit more on the inner world. I like to think, I like to push into things on a real deep level and to take the time to do that. But I have the skill and the ability to still turn it on. I have the skill and the ability to still be in tune with the outer world. So this isn't looking at skills or abilities. It's looking at an individual's innate preferences. Okay. Now, with that said, I am a strong believer and a strong advocate that the two tools that I specialize in, Myers-Briggs and Clifton Strengths, should never be used in the hiring process. But time and time again, I see organizations that are. And again, for the exact reason that I just said. One, they think it's a shortcut. They think it's faster and easier. Well, since this person's going to be doing XYZ activities, we need someone who has a preference of XYZ. Well, someone else might have worked harder to develop this skill and ability than someone else, and they might actually be a better performer in that skill and ability than someone who may have the natural gift or talent for it. Okay, so you may think it's a great shortcut. Don't do it. Don't do it. And the other thing there is, when you're looking at it through the hiring process, a lot of times people there's no ill intent in this, but when someone is trying to apply for a job, they have an image in their mind of what's expected in that job, and they may unconsciously answer questions in an assessment.
Oh yeah. Okay.
To just point and say, oh yeah, you want someone who's going to be able to talk all day, that's really in tune with other people's emotions. Okay, I can answer the questions in that way. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, now it's no longer a tool that's going to give you a foundation of who the person is to build on and to grow and develop them, but instead them just telling you who they think that you want, which isn't going to be helpful at all. So I kind of gave you a few examples there. I'll pause, but I could definitely go all day on that.
There's so much in everything you just said there, Gary, and kind of almost working backwards. If you go through one of these processes, don't game it. It's there to work out what your preferences are, not your skills, right? It's preferences, and we'll come back to that one again. Don't overthink it in terms of yourself. Don't project onto others. So if you're a leader that has an introvert, that doesn't mean that you don't go to them and say, oh, sorry, Gary, you can't present on behalf of the company. You're you're an introvert, because look at the skill, right? And I'll come back to that one as an example in a moment. Also, don't project. This is one that I've seen, Gary, that I really don't like. Don't project your interpretation of someone else, right? So someone says something in a meeting and someone turns around and says, oh, you only said that, Gary, because you're an INFP. That doesn't serve anyone to do that. It's just a way of having an understanding of oneself. It is a way of understanding the collective, no doubt about it, but it's just that. It's an understanding. Don't project. Your message about preference versus skill was almost like perfect, right? Because you are the personification of this. And by the way, Simon Sinek, the same. So here's Gary Williams, wonderful presenter, beautiful communicator, confident, delivers with exceptional skill. Simon Sinek, wonderful speech giver, orator, captures people's attentions. They're both introverts. So their preference is introversion. Their skill is different. And there's nothing wrong with that. So let's unpick that one a little bit, because I think this is one where people do get confused a lot between extroversion and introversion. We might not go through every category of MBTI. We'll see how we go for time. But for this one, let's pick that. What do you think is a good way for people to really think about whether they're truly an extrovert versus an introvert?
Absolutely. So, disclaimer for everyone listening, when I'm using the language introversion and extroversion, I'm speaking about it through the language, through the framework of the Myers-Briggs type indicator. There's loads of examples out there. There's different assessments like the Big Five that use slightly different definitions. So I'm not saying this is the only definition. This is just the framework for the conversation today, okay? So when we're looking at it through the lens of Myers-Briggs type indicator, or MBTI, introversion and extroversion is about where you naturally direct and receive your energy. So someone with a preference of introversion, okay? And if you know your Myers-Briggs type, that means it would start with an I, okay? Someone with a preference of extroversion would start with an E, okay? So introversion is naturally directing and receiving your energy from the inner world. That's the core of what we're talking about here. When we say introversion, we're looking at your energy in the inner world. So that's inside of you. That's your own mind. That's your own thoughts. That's your own feelings, your own emotions, your experiences internally. Now, on the flip side, someone with a preference of extroversion is going to naturally direct and receive energy. They're going to be filled up when they're channeling their energy towards the outer world of other people, events, experiences, ideas, new places, experiences, things outside of you, outside of your own skin, okay? And so it doesn't mean that you are completely unable to access the other preference. We all need both. And when we dig into Myers-Briggs in particular, there's a whole nother foundation under it called the cognitive functions that unpack how you uniquely show up in your inner world and how you uniquely show up in your outer world. Okay. So again, when we're looking at tools like this, there's always more layers. There's always more nuances than just, well, you can't put me in a box. I'm not just quiet, reserved, and in the corner, which are behavioral traits that sometimes people think of when they think of introversion. Really, we're talking about energy and where you're directing and receiving the energy. And that's the core of what we're trying to get to. Sometimes people have a challenging time, whether it's through an assessment or just through a framework like this, to separate behavior from a preference. So kind of like when we were just talking about traits, when we were talking about skills and abilities, you can develop those. I can change my behavior on the context, 100% true. But it's not going to change my preference. I may prefer time to be able to think through things before I answer. But I can behave in a way where I can answer right away. So it just shows the nuances in who we are. So to go back to the core of your question, introversion, extroversion, it's about where you direct and receive your energy towards either the inner world or outer world.
this is not a perfect science, but one of the ones I think of, Gary, is I think about going to a party or a gathering or a conference where there's lots of people and you're interacting with people, you're sharing ideas, whatever the case may be. And I'm an extrovert, by the way, on the extreme end, but it doesn't mean that I don't like my own company either, right? So I can also gain energy inwardly when I need to as well. But if I go to an event like that with my wife, let's say, who is an introvert, when we leave that event, I'm energized. She's exhausted. And we both had the same amount of, it didn't mean that she didn't have fun. She had fun, but she leaves exhausted. I leave energized, going, oh, wow, that was amazing. I'm bouncing off the walls kind of thing, right? Is that a fair test? A simple but fair test? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. Again, there's nuances there.
Yeah.
Right. If someone with a preference of introversion didn't have any human interaction for the whole week, and then they went to that social gathering, they might leave feel energized too. Yeah. So there's nuances. There's a lot more. We're looking for the broader themes and patterns, but that's a great example. And to think of it now behaviorally, how you might show up in the car ride home, the bus ride home, whatever you're doing, your energy is probably going to still be on that buzz where you're talking about it. Oh, did you remember when we talked to, did you hear that? Oh, did you see them do this? Da, 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 da. And meanwhile, your wife might just be like, smile, exactly. Nod.
Yeah, that's it.
That's great, Mick. Yep. Are you done yet? Right? Like behaviorally, it may show up differently. And again, there's nuances there, but that's a beautiful example, 100%.
Well, I'm going to test something with you that I was thinking about the other day, and we'll see how this goes, because maybe not all of the audience are completely aware of every single category. So I'll leave it in your expert hands to talk people through this. So I've always been, and I still am, to cut to the end of the story, I've always been an ENTJ. All right, so that's been my profile and my preference, and it still is today. But there was this moment in time, because I've been studying so much around emotional intelligence, becoming far more emotionally self-aware, far more in touch with being able to pick up other people's emotions. So reading other people's emotions. And I do so much work in this area that I started questioning myself and going, well, hang on a second. Am I an ENFP? And the answer in the end, to cut to the chase, was no. Because what I'm using my understanding of emotional intelligence to rationalize an irrational world. So in reality, that is still an ENTJ behavior, because I'm trying to rationalize everything, but I'm rationalizing it through studying emotional intelligence and psychology. What's your reflection on that?
Yeah. Again, what I love about Myers-Briggs, for example, is when you start digging into the layer underneath it called the cognitive functions, we're looking at the unique way that your mind is wired and how you're going to be operating from that space. So when you're looking at two different types, okay, for anyone out there who's trying to land on their personality type, there's a ton of different free assessments. The official Myers-Briggs is a paid assessment. You could do research, exploratory work. There's tons of ways to land on your best fit type. But one of the things that I love to do is when I'm working with a client to help them find their best fit type is to give them the official Myers-Briggs as an assessment, but to then have a conversational profiling session with them as well. Because sometimes in moments or seasons of our life, we may be focused on developing something so much that we think that that's our natural preference. So for an ENTJ is usually someone who's very logic. So the preferences, for anyone who's not familiar with it, we're talking about extroversion, intuition, thinking, and a judging preference, which means they like structure and organization in the outer world. Okay. So when we're thinking about someone with an ENTJ preference, okay, think of all of the podcast episodes that you've listened with Mick, right? You're going to pick up on some cues there, but big picture, it's usually someone who's very focused on objective analysis in the outer world. They're usually very comfortable with data, metrics, analytics to make very logical decisions. They're usually someone who's good at building and improving systems to optimize things, to make things better in a very processed or systematic way. In a conversation, as a little anecdote, I hope it's okay I say this, Mick, I'm going to say it anyways, but in a conversation that I had with Mick before, he was showing me a little bit of his business and his ideas, and it was created with these flow charts and very clear points of, okay, these are the structures and processes and how I imagine things organized in my business. And again, that's a superpower of someone with ENTJ preferences, to build those frameworks in a way where there's outer world structure. And we know that this is how it's built. This is the structure around it. Whereas someone with ENTJ preferences, if they're developing a skill like emotional intelligence, which any human being can focus on, you may start to think, well, wow, am I actually way more in tune with people? And is my preference for decision-making actually more around the values and the perspectives of people than it is the systems and structures and processes? And that could start to get really confusing. Because wait a minute, I really like this new thing that I'm learning about emotional intelligence and people. But in a conversation, in a profiling session, we have your baseline data from the assessment, which is self-reported, but then we can dig in. And my hypothesis, we didn't do this, so I'm going to put words in your mouth and you can correct me, right? But my hypothesis would be, well, emotional intelligence allows me to better interact with people so that I can meet my goal. Emotional intelligence is a skill that I can develop to be able to better tap into the potential of people so that I can get them operating from where they're best at so they can reach their goals.
Yeah. It is.
And that's a very quote unquote ENTJ way of thinking about emotional intelligence.
For the audience at home, I think I now owe Gary a consulting fee. He nailed it. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, well done, sir. All right, very, very good. I want to bring us now back to purpose, but I've got a specific question. How do we bring both those two things together now? So if we've understood our personality type, if we've explored and clarified our purpose, how do we put those two together for greater impact?
Yes. So when I work with clients, the process I usually do is I start with personality. And the reason why I start with Myers-Briggs, Clifton Strengths, because so often we have been conditioned to show up in a certain way based off of the roles that we are in. And my first goal is to decondition you a little bit, get you back to the root of who you really are here. So a lot of times people, when they're in a particular job, or they're in a particular relationship, or they're in a particular role, like I'm a father, or I'm a mother, or I'm a CEO, when you think about those roles, we often think this is how I am expected to show up. And we start behaving in that way. And sometimes our behaviors are not a reflection of our natural preferences. So to build that foundation, we want to get you figuring out, okay, how do you most naturally operate? So we can get you moving with the grain. So you can be swimming with the stream, to use the fish analogy, right? That's our first goal. Now, once we have that language, now we're thinking about purpose as that way to be able to direct and aim your focus in a really intentional way so that you're bringing that fuel, that fulfillment, that passion, that fire that we were talking about earlier into a specific context, okay? So the purpose is going to start to give us direction. So now that gets that core belief out. But a belief itself isn't action. A belief itself isn't going to change the world until you do something with it. And now that is where we loop back over to personality. Once we know the core belief, we can start getting you to operate your how, your process, in a way that's most natural for you. Not the person sitting next to you, not the way that people expect you to behave, but the way that your brain is naturally wired. And now we have the magic sauce here to be able to have a direction, a core belief of everything that you do. You're operating from the unique way that your mind is wired so that you're tapping into your natural wiring so you can go out and actually create that change, whether it's through your business or in your family or in your relationships, whatever it might be.
I'm hearing something really interesting here, and I want to test it with you. I'm hearing an emerging property from getting a deep understanding of your personal preferences and adding it to that clarity of purpose, heading towards fulfillment and joy. It's almost like a flow plus plus state. That if you can find that flow where you're in that fulfillment and joy state around your purpose, and you're doing it in a way that is in alignment with your preferences, then there's going to be a multiplication effect. And I just made up that flow plus plus, by the way, on the spot. But that's what it sounds like to me. Not only are you in the flow, but because you're respecting your preferences, you're probably flow multiplied or flow magnified. Your thoughts on that?
100%. Because now we're not just focused on the activity. A lot of times when we go to those flow state things, we think, oh, I get flow when I insert activity here, like we did earlier, right? When I'm being creative, when I'm building a process or a flow chart, when I'm building a business, when I get to do marketing, when I get to hop on a sales conversation, when XYZ, right? Okay, that's something that you can do, but we know you can do anything. There's no limitations there. And so when we're doing the thing in the way that you're most naturally wired, yeah, now it's not only the activity that you love, but how you do the activity, the process that you're getting that goal accomplished or that activity completed. It's all in alignment, just like you said, and it's going to feel even better. Absolutely.
So with art imitating life for a moment, I'm going to say that we've been going for way over an hour and it feels like 5 minutes to me, Gary. I think we're in the flow state. All right. So I've got a few other questions I'd like to ask you. Looking at your experiences, you've worked quite internationally. You've also worked in not-for-profit organizations. You've worked with multinational companies. You've worked with a large variety. What impact does culture have here around purpose and around everything that we've been talking about today?
So what's beautiful about language is one word can have so many different meanings. So when we think about culture, there were different layers that started popping into my mind. And so I want to unpack that a little bit. Okay. When we're thinking about culture, there's the broader, more holistic cultural perspective when we're thinking about a society level. So I'm in the United States. If you're listening, you could be somewhere else in the world. There's different cultural norms depending on where you might live. And that may impact the flavor of how things show up and how, most importantly, you are quote unquote expected to show up. Different cultures have different norms. In some parts of the globe, it's appropriate to walk down the sidewalk, smile, and say hello to someone. In other cultures, they're going to look at you like you are completely lost your mind. Why is this stranger looking at me? What do we stop? No, let me just do my thing, right? There's different cultural norms based off of where we live sometimes. Okay. And now when we start looking at that, there's micro and subcultures within that. So again, I'm classic American over here, just going to use America as the example, but it's the culture that I know best, right? Even when you look at the United States, there's subcultures. If I say Midwestern United States versus the South versus the East Coast versus the West Coast, you probably have different images rolling through your mind. And those are going to be the different subcultures within the United States, but then also getting more specific. Okay, well now even in the Midwest, which is where I live, if we're talking about a really rural environment or a really urban environment, there's different cultural norms. And we can continue to follow that all the way down to a specific group of people. So think of your team and your organization. Guess what? Your company has a team culture. But But even stronger than that company's culture is the individual department or team or group of people that you work with on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes there's a clash between the culture of one department compared to the culture of another department, which is now competing for the culture of the entire organization. So now that I've completely just reframed culture, right? All of those are going to play an effect into how we show up, specifically when it comes to the tension between who we really are and what's expected of us.
Mm.
When we think about cultural norms, a lot of times it boils down to expectations. What is expected from me? And I think of the phrase, this is how we do it. When we think of cultural norms, well, this is how we do it here. How many times have you heard that in a team or a company or organization? Well, why are we, this is how we do it. But shouldn't we, but this is how we do it. We're speaking to the cultural norms, the way that we operate. And sometimes those cultural norms are really healthy and they give us those structures and the systems and the processes to have the predictability and the expectations that, okay, well, this is how we do it. But other times we can kind of get caught up in a rut where things get outdated and maybe this isn't how we should do it. And we should talk to Mick and challenge the status quo a little bit and think of a new and effective and more heart-centered way to lead. And so I think, again, there's just so many layers, but I think the main takeaway that I would give with that answer is the element of expectation.
Yeah, I love that. So expected behaviors versus preferences, expected behaviors versus purpose. Yeah, there's definitely something in that, Gary. And by the way, I am that person that you described, that person that walks down the street and smiles at everyone and says good morning and waves. And yeah, I get a few people that look at me like I'm some kind of weirdo, let's face it. Yeah, it happens. But that's who I am, and I'm not going to change that. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Gary. I've learned so much from this session, and I know that our audience has as well. I want to get into our rapid fire round now. So you're a best-selling author. I need to ask you this question. What is your favorite book? Apart from Choose Your Best Life. Oh, you can say that if you like, but
my favorite book. Oh my goodness. Mick, this is always a challenge to pick a favorite book for someone who just really likes to learn. Because, okay, well, favorite in what context? There's so many different domains out there. What type of book are we talking about? When I think most recently, I think some of the work that has shaped my own worldview the most is Simon Sinek, who we talked about a bit earlier. And he has several books out there. His TED Talk is in his book, Start With Why. So that's a great one. And yes, I'm cheating, but by choosing a favorite author instead of book. And he also has another one out there called Leaders Eat Last. And I think that one is another great book to start looking at the impact of some of the things that we talk about today, but from more of that cultural perspective and how things can start to overlay and overlap within the outer world, within a team and organization and leadership. So I'm cheating by naming two with one author.
That's okay. With that. What about your favorite quote?
Ooh, so many good ones out there. Depends on the day, depends on the season, depends on the message that I need to hear. You're gonna catch a theme here that one of my preferences is it's sometimes hard for me to articulate my own preferences when it comes to things like favorites, which is not uncommon with my personality type. So you're making me step outside my comfort zone, Mick.
Oh, good.
My favorite quote. I'm going to choose one that, there's so many good ones. So this is a quote that we used as a core piece of inspiration with a nonprofit that I worked with years ago that focused on student leadership development. And it's everything's impossible until it's been done. Nelson Mandela. And I think the power in that is it allows us to have limitless thinking. It allows us to think what could be, what are those things that we might think to be impossible in our own lives, and how can we accomplish it? How can we do it so that we're starting to broaden the horizons of what could be. So in this moment, that is the favorite quote I'm going to choose to select.
Well done. I really like that one. One for the audience to all think about for sure. What's the one thing that you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
Mm-hmm. When I think back to when I was 20, oh, so much. I would have to remind myself and tell myself it's okay to take action. I think especially in my early 20s, I've been an overthinker for my whole life. And I think sometimes that can hold me back from moving out into the world and having as big of an impact as I could have. So when I think back to my 20-year-old self, I would say it's okay. Just move, take action. If you fall flat on your face, you're going to be able to get back up. It doesn't have to be all perfectly worked out in your own mind before you start moving and building something and creating something in our world.
Yeah, beautifully said, Gary. I love that. And finally, I'm sure that, as I mentioned, our audience would have gotten a lot of value out of today's session, as I have as well. If they'd like to get in contact with you, Gary, and explore further your work, or maybe have a consultation and talk about their purpose and their personality type, how do they get in contact with you?
Yeah. So I would recommend just heading over to my website, which has a hub of all of the ways that you can connect with me. And then feel free to reach out in the way that you're most comfortable. So betterfuturecoaching.com is my homepage, my website there. And then if you kind of want the quick and dirty summary, if you go to betterfuturecoaching.com/links, LINKS, that's going to have just kind of a quick menu. There's a free guide there if you're trying to explore your personality type. There's all of my social media handles are linked up there. So if you want to explore some of the other things that I've done and talked about, feel free to do that, as well as a button to be able to click and hop on a call with me if you want to just chat through some things and look at how we might be able to collaborate in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gary. Once again, great honor to have you on the show. I learned so much. I know that our audience would have as well. I'm going to put that link into our show notes as well. And I do encourage you to check out Gary's book, Choose Your Best Life. It's really good. I've read it over the last week. Wonderful book, well written, with lots of practical things that you can stop and think, and to refocus your life on what's most important to you. So thank you so much, Gary. Absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks so much, Mick. I appreciate it.